Lovely. Let's make a start then. So this is the first one of these sessions you've come to. We'll basically spend roughly 30 minutes going through the scenario and kind of the training element, if you want to call it that, and then we'll break up to 15 minutes or so of questions if people want to do that. Once we get to that point, you can unmute your mic and speak if that's the way that you want to ask questions and talk. But through the session, we will have mics on mute. So about maybe 3, 4 months ago now, I was actually sat exactly where I am today on a Zoom call with a fellow tax professional who's been working in tax for about 3 years. And she was telling me that basically recently she got involved in some advisory work and she drafted a tax advice memo as part of that. And she drafted up this memo, she'd sent it across to her manager, who had basically reviewed it, made some changes, added some comments, and it had also gone to the director for final review and final sign off. And so let's call her Jane for the purpose of this. So Jane had basically seen the version that she sent over and created and the final version that had gone to the client. And she could see that some changes had been made. And because she was super keen to keep learning and to get better and to improve her advice, she wanted to understand like why some of these changes had been made to her work because she didn't understand how it had improved the advice or why they decided to do things differently. And so over the next few weeks, she tried to figure out and get information from them basically to understand like why these changes were made. But after about 3 weeks, she still got no further. She hadn't been able to get any further feedback from these people, which is a massive shame for her. And I felt frustrated on her behalf because I've been in that situation myself, being someone that's really keen to improve myself and get better. Where I just wanted to get a little bit more feedback from someone to understand like why something's happened, so I could completely relate to the situation. And from a manager standpoint, I think it's their responsibility really personally to give that level of feedback. So it's always a bit bad, I find, when that doesn't actually happen. But anyway, because she'd gone through this and she hadn't got this level of feedback, I had an idea about whether I could use her advice after the changes as the basis for one of these tax lab sessions. And so she sent it over to me, and I had a look through as part of preparing for this session. And I thought, yes, we can absolutely use this. But when I was preparing, actually, I kind of changed what I thought the session was going to be about. So initially, my thought was I'll just completely run through this advice after it's been reviewed with the changes and give my comments around like why I thought these changes were made. But actually, I also thought on the flip side, what I could also do is talk about what you as an individual can do to really maximize your learnings and the feedback that you get from any piece of advice you draft once it's gone through the review process. And when I was on that call with Jane, because I've become kind of so embroiled in my frustration on her behalf that she couldn't get this feedback, I completely forgot about a principle that I kind of stand by when it comes to your career and getting better, which is something that is known as the circle of influence. This is something I learned from a book called Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, and it's a really good principle to stand by. But I forgot about this on that call with Jane because I was just annoyed for her about her manager. But basically, the circle of influence is basically two circles, as you can see on screen now. In the center of that circle, we've got control, and around it, we've got influence. And essentially, what this is saying is you can control what's in that control bit, and everything outside of that, you can only influence it. And in terms of what you can control, you can personally control your own actions. And when I was on that call with Jane, I forgot about that angle. And I wanted to make sure I covered that today as well in this session because inevitably, whilst I do think managers should be giving that level of feedback to someone, sometimes it won't happen for whatever reason that might be, whether they're too busy or just don't want to or whatever it is. So you need to really just focus on what you can control. So very briefly just now, before I open up the advice memo that was sent over by Jane, I'm just going to give a few tips around what you can do yourself, regardless of what your manager does, to try and maximize that feedback that you get from any work that you do once it's gone through that review process. So these are my tips around that. So first off, you may or may not know this, but within Microsoft Word, you can basically compare two versions of a document and it will show you absolutely all of the changes that have been made. So if something was drafted in an email instead of Word, for example, you can pop the before and after into Word and do a comparison. And what's really good about that is you then get to see all these changes that have been made and you can look at those changes one by one and try and understand why those changes were made. Whenever it comes to improving your advice and what's in your version versus the version that goes out, the most important element in my opinion is why those changes were made, because if you don't understand why those changes were made, you won't be able to adapt and think for yourself when you're drafting your own advice, and just seeing what had happened isn't enough. So by doing that, you'll see the what, and then you can start thinking about why. And if you don't really understand why or you have no idea why, that's where you can hopefully get some advice or extra feedback from the people who have reviewed it. So to help with that though, because you need to accept that your manager and the directors are likely to be busy people. And so rather than just try and sit down with them with this full document and go through the full thing, what I suggest you do is that you create a list from your kind of self-reflection stage of all the areas where you want further clarity and further information to understand what changes have been made and importantly why those changes were made. And you can have a bit of a debate about it. What I then suggest you do is you try and put 15 minutes into their calendar. So just have a look when they're free and pop 15 minutes in and just let them know that you've done that. The worst that can happen is they say, sorry, I can't do it, or they decline it. But if you don't try, then you might not ever be able to get this 15 minutes. And obviously, if they're very willing as a manager anyway and very forthcoming with feedback, you might not need to do this, but this can only help. If for whatever reason you can't seem to get a meeting or a chat in with them, then what I suggest you do is you just list out your questions and queries for further feedback in an email. So it could be like, oh, I saw that you made this change in this sentence. I just wanted to understand why. And you can just list them all out and ask them, and hopefully that will encourage them at least to respond by email. And nowadays, this is not something I've actually tried myself yet, but when I was thinking about this morning, I thought you can now actually use AI. So if you've got like an AI tool, like a ChatGPT equivalent that you're allowed to use at work, then what you can do is put in the before and after versions and ask it like, why do you think these changes were made? And that can help spur some ideas too. So these are all things that you can personally control when it comes to trying to get more feedback out of the advice that you've given. Obviously, you're still hoping that your manager will cooperate to some extent, because particularly because of points 4 and 5. But even outside of that, points 1, 2, and 3, and 6 will give you a lot more feedback each time. And I did 1 and 2 an awful lot earlier in my career because I always wanted to see like every change and really try and understand like every change that was made. I probably went a bit overkill to be honest, but that's what I did and it definitely helped me a lot in terms of getting better. So what we'll do now then is we'll have a look at the advice memo that was sent over from Jane. So Jane isn't her real name, but everything else about this is completely true and real. So what she ended up doing is she just took some extracts out of this tax advice memo that she had drafted. She showed me the version with the tracked on, and she also put her own comments alongside it too, so I can kind of be a bit more pointed with the comments that I give in relation to this. So this is actually someone that wasn't working in UK tax, by the way. They're working in another country. I won't say which one, just because that's going to help potentially figure out their identity and they want to keep that anonymous. So basically, this is some background on this. So in this case, the client is a local bus service provider and it provides or intends to provide a range of benefits, including bus passes, health and life insurance, awards, lunches during training courses, entertaining events and accommodation to its employees and contractors. And the client would like to know the benefits in kind implications and reporting requirements on these benefits provided to its employees and contractors. So this is good context for understanding like what this advice is about before we jump into looking at the bits that we are going to review and go through today. So she said that her manager had a meeting with client and noted different kinds of benefits the client would queries, then handed it over to her to prepare a tax memo. The memo has been reviewed by both the manager and the director. Haven't had any communication with the manager or director about the changes yet. The memo was not yet sent to the client, so it might not be the final version. Not all changes are tracked properly. I only inserted screenshots where there are tracked changes or I have different thoughts and reflections. Okay, that gives a bit of scene setting then for the purposes of this. And so when I actually looked through this as part of the prep, I actually think a lot of what Jane had done was actually really good. Um, so a lot of, or at least some of the changes, as you'll see, I think are quite trivial and aren't even necessary actually as part of the review process. I think it's nice to know actually which changes that people make to your work, which ones are considered essential and necessary, and which ones aren't. So here then, so we've got some bullets from the executive summary. So it says benefits in kind are valued as the total direct or indirect cost incurred by the employer for providing the benefit, except for benefits of vehicles, accommodation, or share schemes, where the value is calculated differently as defined in law. So this is a change that was added here. Personally, I think this is a pointless addition. Does it really matter if it's defined in law or elsewhere from the client's perspective? I would say absolutely not. And so I think it's a non-essential change. If anything, it's a style change. And personally, law shouldn't be capitalised, so I would leave that lowercase. It is not a proper noun. There is a benefit in kind exemption threshold of £250 per annum, where an employee is not taxed on the cumulative benefits up to this amount. However, Total BICs are still required to be included on the employee's tax return, even if falling below this amount. So there's some tiny changes here. This is an error actually that I see a lot. This is just a punctuation thing. It's not really a tax thing per se. But whenever you want to connect two different sentences together with the word however, it's actually two separate sentences, so it should always be separated by a full stop, not a comma. And this is something that I see and change a lot actually myself when I review other people's work. Um, I think this is a worthwhile change from the word they to total benefits in kind. The reason for that is I think whenever you use words like it or they, there is some chance that the other person on the other end will not be able to realize that you're talking about, in this case, the total benefits in kind. And so by being specific about exactly what it is, in this case, total bits instead of they, you are removing a chance where someone else might not understand what you're talking about or might misunderstand what you're talking about. And it does feel clunky at times, but from my perspective, I would always rather opt for clarity and being clear over clunkiness. Ultimately, when something is in writing, there is no opportunity for people as they're reading it to talk to you about it. Yes, you probably should offer the client a meeting or a discussion afterwards to talk through it, but they won't have that at the time. And so, in terms of making it absolutely clear, I think that's a worthwhile addition. This, even if falling below this amount, I think it's probably worthwhile adding that because I can see that being a question that someone might ask, basically, and so they're kind of hitting off a potential question that the client might have about that sentence there. So I think that's good. So let's look at this one then. So it is possible for the employer to settle any tax that would be due on the benefit provided by grossing up the value of the benefit and submitting a global assessment return to tax authority, I assume that's meant to be, and paying 20% income tax on the total value of the benefits declared. Okay, so I probably myself would have crossed out this grossing up the value of the benefit too. And the reason I would have taken that out is I think most clients are not going to understand what you mean when you say grossing up the value of a benefit. Now, some of you here work in tax, and I work in employment. Well, obviously, all of you work in tax actually, but some of you here will work in employment tax and probably know exactly what that means. Some of you will not work in employment tax and may not know what we mean by that. And so I think it's a sentence that could be easily misunderstood or not understood by a client, and therefore I wouldn't put it in unless I'm going to explain what it is. And actually, what they ended up doing here, the reviewer here added something that is much more clear from my side of things. So I think that's better. So what did Jane say in this case then? They said global assessment return. I initially didn't include this bit because I thought as a bus provider, the client may not consider setting the employee's tax due on the BIC and the calculation is more complex if employers pay this tax. Now I realise this option should be notified to the client at least. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I say a lot actually is you shouldn't second guess what a client might and might not want to do. The purpose of us giving our advice is to tell them of the options and allow them to make the decision. Yes, we should be giving our recommendations in terms of what we believe they should do based on what we know about that client and what we think is best for them. But we shouldn't omit information which means that the client isn't aware of something that is possible. And it seems that Jane in this case realised that she should have done that in this case. And I agree that they should absolutely do that. The circled part is personal plus jurisdiction name tax return. However, I think it should be personal plus jurisdiction name plus income tax return. So going from personal UK tax return, I think it should be personal UK tax return. Yeah, I agree. I think that's weird wording or weird way of wording that. I would agree with this person there, but it's a trivial grammatical point in this case. Okay, so next page then. So this concept of this table here, I think is really nice. I think it is summarizing a lot of information very succinctly and easily for a client to understand. So we've got BIC categories, which is the type of benefit, fair enough. Purposes, taxable benefit in kind, and value. So I've got my own comments on this outside of what the reviewer had changed. So I could just be enough with this, but I think whenever you're using table categories, then what falls under that category, so in this case, what falls in this column should always be the purpose. What always falls under this column should be related to the taxable BIC, and what always falls under this column should be value. What we'll see as we go through this is that actually this purpose thing isn't always the purpose. And I think that can make it a little bit confusing or potentially confusing to a client. And so I'll just make sure that if you're going to use different categories, that you really do stick to those categories and only put that information in there. So in this case, we've got bus passes. They said the purpose is for commuting to workplaces and for private use. They said where it's commuting to a workplace, that it's exempt, where it's private use, it's taxable. Value of the benefit is a direct or indirect cost. I would have a question here. It might not be clear exactly what is meant by a direct or indirect cost. I'd potentially think about giving an example, unless that's explained somewhere else in the report. So let's have a look at the next category then. To current employees exempt NA, so health insurance to current employees, health insurance to historic members. That was must have just been a typo by Jane. Taxable, yes, the company to assess. Now this one, um, that was quite unhelpful because as a client, I'm going to think, what does that mean and how will I assess it? So maybe the rest of the report addresses that, but I think I would change that to be more clear if possible, or note to where else that's explained if it's really long and chunky, for example. Let's have a look at some of these other ones, and let's have a look at the awards, vouchers for excellent customer services, taxable, yes, in full. Okay, so there's a crossing out here, and I don't understand the tax rules in this jurisdiction, so I can't comment on whether they were technically wrong. Let's see what they said in their caseworker thoughts. So they said under the award section, that actually was not planned, by the way. That's worked out very nicely. So caseworker thoughts. Under award section, each voucher for excellent customer services values £50. It seems a good idea to remove to the extent. I'm not sure, quite sure I understand what they mean here. Under reward section, so that's this. Vouchers for excellent customer services, that's that. Values £50. It seems a good idea to remove to the extent. I'm not sure I know what they mean by that. And they're using 50 here rather than 250. I wonder whether this was a technical error or not. But if they wouldn't be taxable, um, if it was less than £250, I'd make that clear in this value section, which isn't done currently. My typo should have been historic, not historical. I didn't find this error when I was reviewing. Yeah, that happens sometimes. Like obviously, when you're sending your advice over to review, you want to make sure that you proofread it and you try and make sure that no typos slip through. The reality is that sometimes that will happen though, but you clearly don't want your drafts to be um, littered in typos. Okay. What I'm going to do on this health insurance one is I'm going to read what their comments are first, because that might help me be more targeted in the comments I give. So her manager's review points then, so they said, need to understand from the client what is meant by historic members and what kinds of health insurance is offered. Okay, so let's see, come back to that in a second. So caseworker thought, wasn't sure what historic members means in the manager's meeting notes, but finished this section by treating historic members as ex-employees and the manager may check with client. Should I not write anything in this section until my manager clarifies with client, or am I doing the right thing? Okay, so this is definitely going to be a slight preference thing, but I'll tell you what I think is best in this case. So if you're unsure on what is meant by a certain fact or statement, is first off, I think you should clarify exactly what is meant by it for a few reasons. The main one that comes to my mind is you could end up writing something assuming it means one thing, be completely wrong, and then all that time you spent drafting something is going to be redundant and you've wasted time as a consequence of that. So I think it's always best to do that. There's multiple things you can do in that case, right, to clarify. So in this case, it looks like Jane didn't actually have direct contact with the client. So it would have been inappropriate for her to call up the client to ask or to send them an email to ask. But what she could have done is just message the manager at the point she was drafting this and just said, well, I've come across this in your meeting notes. I'm unsure what's meant by this. Do you know what it means or do we need to ask the client? And then if they come back and say something like, oh, I'm not sure, we need to ask the client, because clearly in this case they didn't understand what it meant, then Jane could offer, for example, to draft an email to go to the client for her manager to send over and to get this information. So what I do find sometimes is that people like try and just finish a version of a report or a version of a piece of advice. And clearly that is good to work to that. But I find it quite frustrating as a reviewer if what comes over to me has points in like that, because that I think before it comes to me, that bit should have been finalised and completed. And actually, it's more efficient to just address that point as it becomes an issue. And I think her manager in this case would have appreciated that. So I assume then this is all that these highlights here are for under this health insurance section. So we understand that Westfield Health Insurance is offered to employees after 3 years of employment, excluding zero-hour contract employees and school drivers. Vitality Health Insurance is available to a few historic members, and there is a possibility of extending it to more employees. Health insurance cover for medical costs of the employee and their family is an exempt benefit in kind. This also includes the cover for dental insurance, critical illness, and long-term disability. However, this does not cover payments made by employers into employees' individual arrangements. On the basis that the health insurance provided to the current employees are under the company's own arrangement and the company does not make payments to employees for their individual arrangements, the health insurance should be an exempt benefit in kind and no reporting is required. I'm just going to point out here, by the way, I think this is really good. Um, so what someone could do is lay out the rules that the client could come to their own conclusion. And it seems like in this case that a level of assumptions need to be made in order to know what the tax outcome is. And so rather than give like really wishy-washy advice and just lay out the rules, which most clients do not like to see, they've based their conclusion on assumptions and made those assumptions clear because then the client can come back and go, well, actually, those assumptions aren't right. So what do we need to do? Or they could come back and go, those assumptions are right. And therefore, we now know the answer. So where health insurance is provided to former employees, historic members, it may be regarded as the individual's own arrangements and therefore taxable BIC with the corresponding value required to report it. Okay, so yeah, we've addressed that point then. So I think they should have figured out what that meant before they drafted and finished the advice. Let's have a look at the next one then. So this one is the awards section. So what was the comments this time then? So directors' review points. Is the awards night event only open to long service employees or can everyone attend? Caseworker thoughts, didn't think about that and not sure why I should consider this point. Right. So this one sounds like a technical point. It sounds like the director might believe that this information that they've asked for here is relevant to determining the tax impact. So I suspect that is what the director's getting at with this. Um, so as Jane in this case, what I would do is I would go and look up the rules around this to see what the rules say, because that will probably either confirm or deny that this point is relevant. And if it isn't relevant, then I'd be asking the director, like, what do you think the relevance of this information is, or why do you think it's needed to determine the tax treatment, and try and figure that out. It seems like a technical point more than anything else in this case. So I don't think we probably need to read through all of this in this case. Accommodation. So this is the next section. Let's see what Jane said in this case. So Jane said, under local law, accommodation provided to employees might be a benefit in kind, and there are no cases in the law, not that I'm aware of, that how to treat reimbursement of accommodation. Okay, so they're talking about the difference between where the employer is providing it versus reimbursing the costs, it seems. So initially, I considered this reimbursement as a BIC in the lack of the law. Then my manager corrected it as not a BIC. Director further removed the furnished, unfurnished part that my manager added. Okay, so this one again seems like a technical point. Um, so what I would have done in this case as part of drafting this advice is I would have done research. So it's not clear here whether Jane actually did some research and tried to look into this point, or whether she was just using what knowledge she already had. And so whenever you're not sure on a technical point, you should always check before finalizing the draft that you want to send over for review. It is incredibly frustrating, and personally, I find it the most frustrating if some advice is provided to me, drafted by a colleague, and they're put in a point that they're not sure whether it's right or wrong. I think as a tax advisor, the thing that we should be absolutely getting right is the technical. So researching it yourself and having a look yourself is part of that. Sometimes time constraints might mean that that's not possible for some reason. And bare minimum, I would at least ask the person that you're sending it to if they know the answer, because they might know the answer off the top of their head, or they might be able to point you in the right direction. But it is a massive pet peeve, and I think it's a big no-no to leave in something that you're not sure is technically right in the advice. So I'd always make sure that is addressed. So that one just seems like a technical point again. Um, Easily done to address that one. So benefit in kind is paid by the employer. So Jane's thoughts. I have a different opinion for the title that my manager named. Benefit in kind is paid by the employer. I think this section discusses what should the employer do if it is paying tax arising on the employee's BIC. Do you have any thoughts on how we should name the title? Okay, so whilst I am very picky with stuff like this myself, I am going to say that actually doesn't really matter that much. Um, it is, as long as the title is clear and sufficient, it doesn't matter too much. Now, if you had a title and you had information in that that's completely irrelevant to that title, then it would be an issue because a client won't be able to then navigate through that advice easily and find the information that they want, and it might end up being confusing to them. But in terms of like just a name that is good enough, then it's fine. I think they shouldn't worry too much about this in this case. It would be nice to know exactly why they changed it though for Jane's information. But let's just see what change we made here. Then actually, there's quite a lot of track here, so this is probably going to be hard to go through live. So, is there anything substantial here? I think this here is probably just a mixture of style changes and trying to make it flow better. Um, Again, without knowing these tax rules in this jurisdiction, I don't know exactly whether the person said things that were right or wrong, but that's something that they would like to know really, like, is what they're saying right? And is it just style changes or are they just clarifying for some reason? I suspect in this case it's clarifying and making it clearer what's being said. Record keeping. Okay, so what did they say this time? So Jane's thoughts, why should we remove those examples? So bus passes apparently can be used for both business and private purposes. I think it's a good example. Can we keep it? Similar as lunches provided in the training, can we keep it? Okay, so let's have a look at what's said here then. So the value of benefits may need to be time apportioned. So a diary is required to show the periods in the year they were available. Business use. The value of a benefit can be reduced where there is both private and business use. The company needs to maintain a log to demonstrate the proportion of business use, if possible. And they put e.g. bus passes, which is being taken out. Okay, so actually, it doesn't seem like what they would have had there before, e.g. bus passes, actually flowed really as part of that sentence. Um, if they wanted to have something about that, it should probably say something like, the company needs to maintain a log to demonstrate the proportion of business use. For example, like in relation to bus passes. I just think using the word e.g. here is not good. Generally speaking, as well, by the way, I don't think the times when it's okay, but I don't think using e.g is formal enough for like proper advice that's put in writing. I think it's okay to use that on an email, generally speaking, but if it's going to say a report or something, I think EG is not a good idea. I'd rather just say, for example. I think it comes across better and more professional. If a reduction in benefit is claimed on the grounds of business use, the employer's BIC computation must be supported with suitable records. This is just a style change. So it looks like they initially said must be backed up by suitable records or must be supported with suitable records. To me, there's nothing really in that. They both say the same thing. I'd say actually the change is probably slightly worded better, but really it's trivial. Exemptions. So where benefits are covered by statutory exemptions, the company must keep sufficient details to demonstrate that the exemption is properly due. E.g., so lunches provided in the work-related training have been taken out. Health insurance being an employer scheme for employees. So let's go through that again because it hasn't sunk in. So the company must keep sufficient details to demonstrate that the exemption is properly due. Okay, so I think this is probably similar to before. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to put in examples here, but I think this section of the report looks like it's to do with what is record keeping. And so I think if you're going to list some of the ones where records are needed to be kept, then really for completeness, you should be listing all of the cases where that needs to be. I think giving a one-off example by itself, it feels like an omission, and I think actually it's probably better to not list them at all if you're only going to list one of them. So I actually agree with taking that out. I think it's better. But then the reviewer has also then said, e.g., health insurance being an employer scheme for employees. Okay, but they've done the exact same thing. So I think really the reviewer here has just been a bit silly because they clearly think it's okay to leave that in or an example in, but they've just changed the example. Now, maybe the example here was not a good example. Again, not knowing the area of tax, the tax and the jurisdiction here. I don't know for sure, but maybe that could be it. This is just a slight change in title. Season to provide taxable benefits, stop providing. It's a more professional way that that's written, to be fair, using the word season. Okay, so we're almost bang on time there, actually. So that brings us to the end of the 30 minutes. What I'll do in a second is I'll change the settings so you can all unmute your mics if you want to. And you can also start putting questions into the chat function if you prefer. Just whilst you do that, I'm just going to segue over into that section, into the Q&A section. So in this session today, what we've just gone through is some tax advice that had been drafted and it being reviewed by a manager and a director. And we've talked through the changes that have been made so that you can hopefully see how those changes have made the advice better and you can learn from that to make your own advice better. But what we haven't covered in today's session is how do you actually go from the start of an advisory project to having a draft completed, ready for review. That isn't something that we've spoken about today. And that bit actually can be really tricky, especially for those that are new to advisory work or if you're transitioning into advisory work. I actually teach a 7-step process to help with this, as well as teaching the characteristics that should exist in your tax advice to ensure that it is high quality. And by knowing these steps and by knowing these characteristics, you will improve your confidence for providing advice, You'll procrastinate less when you're drafting advice, and your colleagues will make less changes to the draft advice that you could do before sending it to the client. And I teach all of this in the tax advice masterclass. A recent attendee said that she no longer fears advisory work and that she found the course extremely useful. A head of tax said, I've noticed a big difference in my colleagues' confidence, and the advice they are now providing is a lot more tailored and more focused on what the client needs to know. Overall, a great course that adds value. So, if you do want to become good at providing tax advice and you want to become good more quickly, the masterclass is a streamlined way to help you achieve that. So, you can scan this QR code on the screen now if you want to go and have a look at more details around that. The next one actually starts on the 1st of July. I'll also put a link now into the chat function too, in case you can't access through the QR code. I will just change the settings real quickly now in case any of you want to unmute your mics and speak to me, ask any questions, whether related to this scenario in particular or just tax advice more generally. It really doesn't matter. Please feel free to ask any questions that you want to ask. So you should now be able to unmute yourselves, and we'll see whether there's any takers. I suppose as a question then for people, because maybe you haven't got any of your own questions at the moment, is there anything that you can relate to from this session? Like, is there anything that you tend to do or that you tend to find hard when it comes to advice or changes that your manager tends to make to your work? Is there anything that comes to mind at all, anyone? Using EG. Yeah. So actually, for what it's worth, Katie is actually in my team as well. Do I usually change that, Katie, when I review your work?
Do you
Be too
usually, can you
wordy,
hear
you
me?
don't live.
Can you hear
That,
me?
that that's easily done. I think where a lot of words can be used where it's unnecessary is to explain like the tax rules in a lot of detail. My own kind of view around explaining the tax rules is if if something isn't ambiguous, so basically it's clear, I don't think there's any need to explain the tax rules that sit behind the answer. You can just tell the client what the conclusion is. But where there's a level of ambiguity there and subjectivity, I think bare minimum you have to explain the reason for the subjectivity so that the client can understand and make a decision. But my own kind of approach here is to not explain more than you need to explain the ambiguity. That can help take a lot of words out. So Emma said, I don't do full-on advice reports, but I do struggle to get feedback on work done. Yeah, it might be more difficult with, so is it compliance related work you're talking about there, Emma? Because that's going to be more difficult, I would say, to do. Well, you probably won't be able to do the word comparison. But if it's just, say, an email to a client or something else, then you can definitely pop those into Word and do the comparison.
Yeah, I think that'll be really useful actually. Thank you.
Oh, I think someone's trying to speak. I think it's coming out some different headphones. Let me just change my settings. Oh, that should work now, just in case someone wanted to say something. Um, what I would suggest, Emma, then in your case, is where changes are made, note them down and just try and put 15 minutes into the person who's reviewed its calendar and have a chat with them. And if you can't do that, do the things that we talked about before, which is try and figure out like why those changes are made and why what you did wasn't right if changes are being made. Charlotte has said sometimes it's hard to balance being formal but also explaining in terms the client would understand, particularly when the client is an individual rather than a business. Yeah, I can see that. Um, I would say actually it's not necessarily whether you're being formal or not. I think where clients can get confused is where you're using tax jargon. So if you're using words that basically you would not understand if you did not work in tax, that's going to be a bad idea. But if you're using words that are formal, that people, regardless of whether they work in tax, understand, that's fine. So, for example, I don't know, a BIC, benefit in kind, that is slight jargon that we've used in today's session. I tend to use the word just benefit actually when I talk to clients rather than benefit in kind because the in kind bit doesn't really add anything from my side and the client will know what we're talking about. Like HR people, for example, will refer to it as an employee benefit. They won't refer to it as an employee benefit in kind. So the trick really is figuring out like what normal English words you can use that regardless of if you work in tax, they will understand. And if you really can't get around it and you really need to use tax jargon, then at least explain what it means. That's all you can do. You think the word stuff's useful, Emma? Oh, that's good to hear. I didn't show how to do that on this session, but you can very quickly just Google how to compare two Word documents, and it should show you how to do that. So Douglas has said, I do write reports and have to review my colleagues' work. Flow is key. Shorten sentences so they almost become points, but are not. Leave the piece of work to reread the next day, then review it with a red pen. It is so helpful. Yeah, this is a good point that's made here. It's well, for a start, it's really difficult to review your own work, because when you review your own work, you tend to gloss over it, and you're more intending to think, oh yeah, that's fine. I'll just quickly read over that, and it's really really hard to spot your own errors. It's even harder to spot your own errors if you're reviewing it straight after doing it. So putting it down, leaving it a few hours, or hopefully coming back to it the next day if you can leave it that long, is going to help you to read it with a fresh pair of eyes, so that you will less likely gloss over the errors that you leave in, usually typos. Oh, someone sent a quotation to the Nov December masterclass. Apologies about that. The link here should take to the right one, and if not, I'll just need to fix it after this session. The tax advice one, pre this one is the exact same, by the way, it's just a different date. So Georgia has asked, how do you balance different manager styles when the improvements can sometimes contradict one another? Yeah, that's that's tricky. So I think accepting that style changes exist is a good starting point, because not all changes are actually improvements. They're just improvements in the eyes of the reviewer. So I think if you can like compartmentalize the difference between what is an essential change and what is a style change, that's going to help you straight away. If you can see particular patterns with a certain manager, like they always change something or they like something in a certain way, I would keep like a little list of what their styles are so that when you draft something for them, you can go back to that and essentially use it as like a mini checklist. It is clearly a challenge to keep adjusting your style, but ultimately the person that's going to review and sign off your work, they need to be happy with it. And so you want to aim to draft it in their style to the extent you can. And there's another part to this as well, Georgia, actually, which is if you can if you can convince the manager to not make the style changes, that could help too. There's an element probably here of the manager making changes that aren't essential, and they should probably stop doing that too. It's very easy to do those though. I'm very bad at that myself because I'm quite particular in how I want my advice to be when it goes up to a client. So, is there an approach you take slash rules when a tax advisory piece of work comes across your desk? Sometimes it's just about the approach, vast amounts of legislation, HMRC manuals to check, so the process to start something seems overwhelming. Any advice welcomed? Yeah, so I'll kind of outline my process here, Humza, but this is exactly what I cover in the tax advice masterclass. So my general approach is to first off gather as much information about the client and the facts that are relevant to this work as possible. So that's kind of the first step is establish the facts. Once you've got the facts, you can then start thinking about the relevant rules that are going to apply here and the relevant tax implications. That bit is where you will have to do the research piece, particularly if you're newer to tax. And in any event, I still check now when I'm doing work. I go and at least check the legislation and guidance. So that's the bit that can take a lot of time, and that's actually like a completely separate skill in its own right. That's what I would class as tax research, interpretation, and application. And actually, I teach a completely separate course on that because it's a whole massive topic in its own right. But you want to go through that research methodically and look at each point one by one, basically using guidance, legislation, etc. And you can have a good process around that to make that whole bit more easier. Admittedly, it is going to be overwhelming initially. I think if you're new to tax as well, I would try and take some steer from your manager. For example, like what do they suggest you do next? You could come up with like your own plan in terms of what you think to do and run it past them, and they could tell you something different. They could help you to outline the advice before you draft it up, for example. And so I think it's the balance between thinking for yourself and trying to do it for yourself, but also taking advantage of the fact you've got a manager there to learn from. So hopefully that will help a bit with that. So Charlotte said, I also find printing the report and reading the paper version helps to review my own work. Something about changing the format helps me see things. Yeah, I agree with that. I just don't personally do that because I don't like the waste of paper, but I do agree it is more helpful to read it on paper than on a screen. Lovely. So I think that might be everything then. So what I'm going to do after this session anyway is I will stick this recording onto YouTube and send it round, along with a link to the tax advice masterclass as well for those who are interested. And I will just double check that I have actually updated the page for the next one, which actually starts on the 1st of July this year. But if any of you want to send me messages or questions or anything afterwards, then please do. You can get me on LinkedIn or via my email. But yeah, thanks for coming all. I hope you found this session useful, and hopefully I'll get to see you in a future one. Take care.